You are live.
Good evening. My name is Terry Sparling, and I'm from Huron-Perth Center. And I am just thrilled to have and welcome you to this webinar with Dr. Michael Unger. We've been working with Michael for about 5 years, and in that process, we've engaged with a number of our community partners to bring Mike back to us to do some training, to understand what helps kids grow and thrive, even in spite of some challenges. There's lots we could say about his work, but what I do want to say at this point is that we know that resilience is not a fixed trait, that it's something that can be changed through positive relationships and environmental supports. I want to do a shout out to our social ecological charter members. These are the agencies that have come together to promote Dr. Unger's approach, and that would include Huron-Perth Center, Avon-Maitland District School Board, Huron-Perth Catholic School Board, Choices for Change, our Huron-Perth Public Health, Huron-Perth Helpline and Crisis Response Team, the Local Health Integration Network, Mental Health and Addiction Nurses, and Huron Respite Network. We're very pleased that those partners work with us. I'd like to invite Dana Bizzato from the Huron-Perth Catholic Board to offer a couple of remarks.
Great, thanks very much, Terry. I too would like to welcome Dr. Unger back to our community on behalf of the Huron-Perth Catholic District School Board. We have been supporting and engaged in the social ecological approach as well as a chartered member, as Terry referenced, and pleased to be working collaboratively with community partners in the development of what I would call a circle of support around students and families, all students and families, but especially those where there are some mental health needs that tend to be more complex. And as we draw that circle around families and with families and students, we can see strengthening of their connections and help support them in accessing services that they're seeking. I referenced this earlier. Actually, our board is engaged in the development of a spiritual theme, which guides our work in our strat plan and our mental health strategic plan as well. And the theme is Encounter, Accompany, and Transform. And I see many connections between that theme and the work that Dr. Unger is coaching us in around the social ecological approach in terms of the importance of presence, the importance of being with students and families on their journey, the power, the magic that occurs in the accompaniment and the encounter, and really the transformation in terms of well-being and resilience. So we're just really pleased to continue to support this work and to welcome Dr. Unger back. So thank you.
Great. I can take it from there?
Actually, thanks, Mike. I'm just realizing that
I'd like to do a little bit of introduction.
Here we go.
I know Dr. Unger is very, very eager tonight, but
no.
You need to say a few words.
There was a pregnant pause there, folks.
Okay, we're building our resiliency. Anyways, my name is Dr. Ann Robinson, and I'm the mental health lead with the Avon-Maitland District School Board. I bring greetings from, I welcome Dr. Unger on behalf of Avon-Maitland. And at our board, we also use the SIA approach, social ecological approach, in which we work together with our area mental health organizations for children and youth with complex mental health needs. And we build resilience through relationships and environmental supports. Then in terms of, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Unger. In terms of his background, he is a family therapist and professor of social work at Dalhousie University, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Child, Family, and Community Resilience. Dr. Unger has published over 200 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on the subject of resilience, and he's the author of 16 books for parents, educators, mental health professionals, and employers. These include his most recent work, which is Change Your World, The Science of Resilience and the True Path to Success. It's a book for adults experiencing stress at home, at work, and at home. And he has a book, I Still Love You, 9 Things Troubled Kids Need from Their Parents, and a blog, Nurturing Resilience, which can be read on Psychology Today's website. And now I will turn it over to you, Dr. Unger, live from Halifax.
Yeah. Thanks, Anne and Dana, and of course Terry, who's very kind at making the link and bringing me back to the Huron-Perth community, and indeed to all of you. So this, I really appreciate this, and it's always funny. We're all learning this technology and figuring it out, which is great. And no, I do appreciate the opportunity. So the theme of this was really trying to get at this notion of resilience, and more specifically, trying to really see what it is during a pandemic that might be helpful to our children. Now, what I actually know about resilience from studies all around the world, and indeed my own clinical work, is it's basically what you have before the crisis, which counts a great deal. Though even during the crisis, you can change and grow new things. So, maybe one of the ways that I can show this is, I think I'm very blessed. I live in a community where we know our neighbors, where there's a certain sense of connection. Recently, one of my neighbors turned 52, and of course you can't have birthday parties, but because the community had sewed together a sense of, that we were together, that we knew our children sort of, go back and forth. There's a certain roaming, there's a sense of connections and safety already in the community. We all held for him a virtual, or I should say, a drive-by birthday party. And my point of showing this is that, part of being resilient, showing resilience, is this flexibility to find ways to be our best and boldest selves, even in a crisis. Just thought you'd enjoy just seeing this for just literally 15 seconds. This is how you celebrate a birthday during a pandemic and social distancing.
So I go.
And it's a good example of what happens inside a community or families, etc., when we're already when there's already a set of relationships that kind of can be activated throughout a crisis. Now, this is hinting at a whole bunch of different things. One, you have a sense of people kind of looking after each other. You have it almost, there's still the rituals. People are sort of joining together. People know each other. This is actually how you create safety and indeed sort of long-term sustainability for ourselves and our children. So what I'm learning from this is, look, there lots of people, when we think about resilience, we often focus on our ruggedness, or that individual quality, survive adversity. And it's not a bad idea to talk about, you probably have heard the term grit. And that notion that, there's something about just being able to survive and thrive under stressful environments. I want to debunk that a little bit. Even the original studies done by Angela Duckworth and on that whole notion of grit, et cetera, you got to remember that they were done principally with like Marines in some sort of boot camp. And what she was looking at was basically which individuals were going to push through and survive and persevere and get to the end of the training. But even what she says, if you actually read the book, what she herself says and has admitted later, is that showing grit is not always the right thing for someone to do. Because if you get into this situation of a boot camp in the Marines, and you discover after a few days or weeks that this is really not your passion, that this is not what you want to do, the worst thing you can do is show grit and persevere. In fact, dropping out, reimagining your life in a different way is a bigger strength than just pursuing endlessly. And in fact, I worked once with a young fellow who wanted to go to medical school and applied year after year after year. So 3 times he applied to medical school and 3 times he was rejected. That's not grit. That's stupidity. He should have realized that after the, say, 2nd time or even the 3rd time, that he had other resources, his family had some money, he had capacities to move on and do something else with his life than just pursuing this one sort of mindset of one goal. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because we're in a pandemic, and right now what I see is an incredible amount of resilience in people who show flexibility. We have seen businesses adapt. We have seen us as parents have to adapt our schedules. And I'm hoping that we can convey that to our children as well, so that when asking them to be rugged individuals is great, as long as problems are few. What we also know is as problems increase, you also need to give people, and indeed our children, lots of resources. So you can't just sort of say, well, just think positive and pursue through. Now that the problems are bigger, you're also going to need to give them more resources, ways of amusing themselves, more responsibilities, more expectations maybe, et cetera, et cetera. So suddenly there's always this issue about, which strategy, to be a rugged individual or a resource individual, will always depend on how many problems your kids are facing. Now, most of us and most of our kids, they kind of can match, right? They have a certain amount of normal stressors in their life and they have the resources they need to cope with them. And during a crisis, well, what happens is usually the stressors kind of outnumber the resilience resources until you sort of get back to balance. So when a kid goes from, say, grade 6 to grade 7, junior high, there's more stress. They're suddenly hitting puberty and everything else, and they're out of whack a little bit. Now, the idea of what happens during this pandemic, of course, is that what you're experiencing is we stack the deck on the stress side big time. And we've also stripped away. So we have financial stresses, medical stresses, worries, fears, social distancing. Our kids are underfoot, or we're working at home. We're developing working with new technology. Everything is sort of stacking on the stress side. And we've stripped away our normal ways of coping, whether that's going out for a dinner, getting some time away from our kids, talking to our colleagues informally, just being able to just go to a gym or do whatever it is that we were doing. So our resources are also decreased as well. And so what we're actually seeing is a situation now where we have lots of stress, and our kids also are under a lot of stress, which means it's kind of doubly important right now that we give them some resilience. Now, when you start, we've been developing a lot of ideas about resilience, and there's many different factors that I could list off about resilience. This is just a short list of some of them that are appearing in our work, especially with young people and around anxiety disorders and this kind of thing. We know that generally speaking, if young people are given opportunities to show gratitude, have self-confidence, optimism, solve problems, some mindfulness, if they sleep well, have good nutrition, some physical activity, their mindset is much better. And of course, if we as their adults in their life provide them with some structure, hold them accountable, give them supportive relationships, offer them something, a mirror that says you're special, give them experiences of control, treat them fairly, maybe promote their culture and meet all their basic needs, that they also deal better with the anxiety of this particularly stressful period. Now, my point of this is, I'm going to get into some specifics on this in a minute, but I just want to sort of just broadly get this idea of that kids need to be rugged and resourced, and that brings us as parents into the equation as well. But it is a bit like these are two moving wheels, if you will. So it's kind of like they're rotating around, aren't they? And you're trying to line them up just perfectly so that the rugged qualities meet a nurturing environment that helps kids to deal with exactly the stressors that they're experiencing. So, for instance, we know that kids that have good nutrition tend to also be eating with their families 3 times a week. And so it's not just that you want a kid to, you just don't want to tell them, okay, get some good food into you. You also you can facilitate that or make that more likely to happen by actually increasing the number of times that you're eating as a family. I could take all these other ones as well. So, for instance, if I'm, let's say I took on the right-hand side a sense of control, well, you want people to feel like they have decisions that they can make. We want our children to be making good decisions up to and appropriate to their age. Now, if I took something like sleep on the other side, which is sort of a personal trait, you know, getting good sleep hygiene and stuff, what you want is a perfect mix of that. You want a child should be able to say how much they sleep. Yes, they should have some say over that, but there's also an element of balancing their decisions around sleep with what is really how much control is appropriate for a certain age group. So you're always sort of balancing this notion of what the environment is demanding of our children and what we and what they actually are doing inside. Of course, you know, if you want to build self-confidence in a child, well, you create opportunities for them to be accountable to others. You don't just say, "Hey, you're special," and everything else. It actually, there's no scientific basis for that, by the way. You can't just tell a kid they're special. It doesn't actually work. It's special though if you hold a child accountable. You say, "Okay, I want you to achieve this and whatever else," and they do it. Then generally speaking, what they do is you have a genuine self-confidence boost because there's a sort of a dynamic between, oh, I was expected to walk the dog. I took the dog out. I got around the block. I picked up whatever after the dog. I'm seen as a responsible person in my family. I've made a contribution. I did what I was asked to do. I'm now competent. There's this kind of dynamic between the two, which is really, really important. So let me just quickly go through a few of these. Like I said, this list could, there's literally like about 50 of these different things that you see in the research. Motivation, perseverance, morality, conscientiousness, creativity, humor could all be on this list as well, as could be maybe opportunities to fix one's mistake or receiving good enough parenting, a supportive peer group, maybe recognition for what makes you special, political efficacy, meaning that you have some decisions, you know, outside of your family and in your community to make decisions. All these things combine to make us more resilient, and many of them are things that we as parents can give our kids. So let me just give you a few short ideas maybe. For instance, even very young children, there is something about this time where I think I'm hearing from a lot of my neighbors, you know, children whining, complaining, rightfully so perhaps, that, you know, I can't see my friends, I'm having trouble with this, I don't like this, I want to go to school, I want to do this or whatever, or you're waking me up, and there's a lot of that kind of thing. And I just want to sort of see if we could change that around to making sure every child has an opportunity throughout the day to at some point express gratitude. To say, hey, just to walk our children through that and say, did something today actually go right? Is a really good thing to do, maybe before bedtime or some other point in the day. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get a kid's score up on things like this. So you want your child to be able to answer a question like, oh, I have so much in life to be thankful for. Or if I had to list everything that I felt grateful for, it would be a very long list. Question number 3 is sort of a reverse score thing. When I look at the world, I don't see much to be grateful for. You want a child to not be thinking like that. So this notion of gratitude is very important. You want kids to sort of experience that. And of course, we as their parents trigger them to have that experience. You also want optimism in our kids, right? And there's a lot of good evidence that with optimism that you know, I thought the photo sort of spoke it all. We're always very optimistic before the birth of our children. We have great expectations and everything's going to be great. And then of course the sleepless nights for 18 months kick in, but that's another story. Mostly I'm just trying to get here a notion of, we know, for instance, that cancer patients and university students who are going through stressful exam periods. Optimism, this is interesting. It does not necessarily change the outcome. Just because you're optimistic does not mean that your rate of the way your cancer progresses is going to change. And despite what Rhonda Byrne and that whole secret, stuff, it actually has no bearing in science. But nevertheless, university students don't necessarily get better grades if they're optimistic. But what they do get is they're less stressed. by the experience. And people going through cancer, if they're optimistic, experience less pain. They might be less depressed. They're more able to cope with the series of decisions that they have to make, even if the ultimate outcome from the cancer is about the same. Now, that said, optimistic people do also tend to go looking for more information. So that in some cases could help a child, right? If you can create sort of a sense of optimism in a child, they might look for more information. They do have a better sense of control over their lives and these kinds of things, which are all good as well. So how do you create optimism? Well, I'm gonna change the conversation a little bit to what resilience really teaches us. And this is the whole premise of the book, Change Your World, is you don't just say to someone, be optimistic. What you actually do, and we know from this is actually research based on when we look at people surviving, say, wildfires or major floods, tsunamis, what we know is that people become optimistic, especially children, when their world actually gives them hope for the future. So if you think about it, if you want to, so when I was so impressed when the wildfires that devastated Fort McMurray in northern Alberta a few years ago, there was a group of kids that they just didn't have their grade 12 proms, and you might remember that. And yet what they did was, as a community, they still found a way to get some of those kids dresses and tuxedos and dress them up. And even though they couldn't have the whole formal prom, there was still a sense of the celebration and the photos and everything else. When we do that, we make a kid feel normal again. And we say that your life right now might be crap. But what we can tell you is it is going to get better. We are going to put in place the things that you need to imagine your future the way you want to imagine it. And that's something we give our kids. So right now we don't have any studies on the pandemics. This is a relatively new phenomenon. But what I can tell you is that if we can structure our homes a little bit so that gives our children a sense that this will end, and the contribution you're making right now is very meaningful. You're doing your part, sort of like a war. You're doing your part to keep your grandparents alive and other people who might be vulnerable because of some sort of immunological weakness in their immune systems. Whatever that is, you're talking about now people having, you're giving your child the message that this is going to get better, and I'm going to show you it's going to get better because we're going to, each day we're going to do something that's planning for your future, and we're going to help a kid learn a new skill, pick up an instrument, learn some new songs on something that they're already playing, develop a new skill. If you have a driveway, get them out practicing, whatever. Anything you can do that concretely gives them a new experience. And of course, nutrition is important, not this, of course. We know that kids, if you can provide access to reasonably healthy food during this period and avoid all the junk food or keep it in check, you're going to probably see a child elevate their mood. We do know that there's some connections between our microbiome, or how healthy our gut bacteria are and what we're eating and how we're eating and everything else, and things like depression and anxiety. What we're understanding is there's actual connections between our moods and what we're eating. It's not just sort of made up. We also know that sleep is really important for our children. Too little sleep, not good. The anxiety is more likely. Too much sleep, and you might see depression. The sweet spot seems to be for most, sort of at least adolescents, around 9 hours or more, but not too much more. So what you're constantly looking for is good sleep hygiene. And it's kind of funny, there's all kinds of advice and measures and everything else. You want people not to do, you don't want to take to your bedroom things that aren't sleep related. You don't want to have a lot of distractions for our kids in there. Ideally, their phones are turned off, they're taken away from them. They're invited to do things that are calming. Reading could be one of those things, but definitely get the pings out of their ears whenever you can. All of those things are going to actually not just get your child to sleep properly, but they're also going to buffer them and make them more resilient to some of the anxiety and the stress, and indeed even the depression that could result from where you have long periods of social isolation and all their routines are being broken. And of course, physical activity, no matter how young, our children do better when they're active and certainly outside. the more that we can encourage them to do anything, even if it means walking down the street 6 feet apart from a friend. There does need to be this kind of level of physical activity for our kids, and the more that they have that, we're pretty certain that, especially if it's outdoors, it does seem to elevate mood. It also gives kids, if I might, it's a cascade of other resilience factors like it. I mean, again, I'm going to go back to those two knobs that are turning, right? So if I have physical activity in my life, it probably also means that I'm getting a bit of a self-esteem boost or something. There's always these kinds of interactions between each of these factors, and you want to create this sort of cascade. So for instance, the one that I know maybe parents are finding the most difficult to impose, but also which is so important to kids, and I know this from other research on around the world on say natural disasters. One of the best practices for children, a mental health intervention for children after a tsunami or a natural disaster or indeed a school shooting, if you look at what major aid agencies like the Red Cross and Save the Children, etc., do, they advocate that children return to school very quickly. That is the mental health intervention, not the psychiatrist, not a psychologist, not a mindfulness intervention, not some sort of psychotherapy, not talking to, it's basically go back to school. And the reason why we emphasize that is because once you get the structure and the expectations back in a child's life, you basically create a cascade of other positive things. The child feels safer. They know that there's a routine to their day. And if this happened today and I went to bed and everything was safe and I was okay, and tomorrow follows exactly the same routine, then I will be okay again. So there's a predictability. There's also something nice about the routines that come into our children's lives. They know what to expect. They don't have to make countless decisions every moment. We don't as adults do well with that, and our children don't either. That's why we follow routines. Most of us on the way to work, when we used to go to work, we would stop at the same coffee shop or do whatever it was. It's simpler that way. It reassures us, it's a cue from the outside of us that our lives are predictable and safe. And this is really what you want for structure. So that does mean bedtimes. That does mean expectations for chores, something I'll talk about a little bit later. And this is a gift to a child to set limits on their screen use. I know that a lot of people are going to ask me about this, right? How much screen time? And since we're talking about structure and routine, it's probably a really good time to just branch into that. There is a growing body of research that is suggesting that excessive screen use by kids, especially teenagers, is not great for them. But the jury's a little bit out. Certainly, the younger the child, once you get below age 5, I would challenge you to find a study that says anything positive about a 2-year-old with an iPad. There is, as far as I've seen, not one shred of evidence that that is a good idea. And in fact, anyone who's looked at this suggests that those children tend to have more delayed outcomes in terms of academic abilities, language skills, et cetera, et cetera. And just think about it for a second. If you're strolling down the street with a 2 or 3-year-old in a stroller, and their now attention is focused on an iPad in front of them, they are literally missing all the actual learning that they should be doing. They are now not getting all the social cues from all the people around them, and they're not acquiring the language skills. A child should be acquiring literally somewhere, 8 to 10,000 words before they hit elementary school. And if, unless you're exposing a child to those kinds of instances, they're not going to get. And looking at Dora on the screen is not going to do that. It's in the constant interaction of listening to parents speak to other parents that a child actually acquires, everything from cues on empathy to language, vocabulary, to understanding the world as it's put together. I know it's easy to distract a child with that, but it's actually not necessarily beneficial to their psychological or potentially intellectual development. And that's not an opinion. I think that's actually where the research is beginning to show this stuff. So to limit screen time, once kids hit elementary school, what they say is, well, keep it within limits. A few hours a day is probably necessary, given most kids are on these things. But like, for instance, when they began a study out of Montreal showed that when they tracked, it was part of another study on addictions and everything else, but they actually followed 4,000 kids through grades 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And what they found was very clearly that as use of social media went up, depression rose as well. Now, to be fair, teenagers tend to record some level of depression anyways as they get older. So there's always a little bit of an upward trend. But the upward trend for kids who were using social media a lot was just that much more accentuated. It was really rising much more quickly. Now, here's the interesting thing. More sort of positive active engagement on screens was better than just passive time. So if your kid is at home just watching YouTube and TikTok videos, that's not great. If they're contributing to those videos and they're making their own videos, that's probably okay. And if they're gamers, guess what? If they're gamers and they're interacting with others, they're also not being harmed as much from kids that are just surfing around on social media. This is one-time gamers seem to be winning the race here a little bit on this stuff. So there seem to be some patterns in the literature, which is basically saying, look, try to control the social media. That notion of upward social comparisons is really not good for kids. And we set the structure on this. We have the controls over the internet and their phones. We bought them, I'm hoping, right? And I do think that there's a real need to push our children into frankly, I'm going to say it, they should be bored. Yes, our children should be painfully bored. I know this is going to drive us crazy sometimes, but at least I can understand while we're working, giving them the screens because there's no other babysitter available. But after hours, probably boredom is the better gift we give our kids, because then they have to sort of begin to work on themselves. I'm amazed. We send our kids to all these little mini courses in schools. Our teachers are all inundated with teaching kids to self-regulate, mindful, all these other skills, social and emotional learning. It's all good. Why do we have to teach those kids this stuff? They're at home. You're driving in your car. You're taking them someplace, and we put screens in front of them. And we're going, no, this is like your social and emotional learning course 101. This is the opportunity to learn self-regulation. You're driving for 2 hours to Granny's house or whatever when we did this. But instantly in that moment, this is when the child has to learn to sort of look around, pay attention, interact, self-regulate, keep calm, whatever, you're in your car seat or whatever the deal is. It's too easy for us to be removing this stuff. And then I'm wondering about how much of that is creating some of the problems that we're seeing with kids, that they are dysregulated. So anyways, there does seem to be a pattern that we as parents can provide. I'm really promoting this notion that we provide kids with the structure and the consequences and the routines that they need. During a pandemic, just like after tsunami or in a refugee camp, what we know is that kids who are under stress do better when these things are really in place, and they're expected to fulfill obligations to others. Supportive relationships, of course, are a big part of a kid's life and indeed important. This is probably the most obvious one, that you want your children engaged with you, of course, but not just you. I mean, how many of us are, in this time of a pandemic, if we're going to come back even stronger, how many of us are asking our children to pick up the phone every day and call their grandmother, who's maybe in a nursing home or something, to check in? How many of us are insisting our children really take on some of these social responsibilities in regards to their neighbors? If you're cooking for somebody else, at least in my neighborhood, a lot of people are sort of helping to try and cook for each other. Are your children the ones dropping it on the doorstep, not going within 6 feet of them, not going into the houses, but a 10-year-old might be able to take over a casserole to help out somebody else. So these kinds of supportive relationships, encouraging our kids to find other ways to again, be online in positive ways, actively engaged, hopefully not just through social media, but more interactive ways and catching up with people, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there is this idea of a powerful identity. There's there's something really neat about us giving our children a sense that they have something to contribute to their families. I love it when kids are asked to cook dinners. I'm not sure if you're all doing this, those are listening. Are you having your 10-year-olds cook dinner for you at least once a week? What about a 12-year-old? Like, you know, you might have to supervise them on the stove, but there's something genuine, like I know a lot of us give our kids chores like, you know, the sort of the senseless chores like clean your room. Well, there's no status, there's no cachet, there's no powerful identity in making your bed. But there is when kids actually say, make something for someone else. They help mow the lawn, do some gardening, when they're actually genuinely doing something that makes my life as the parent much better. Or they're simply adding to the community's well-being. I want to give you an example of this. Emily Tuck, if you recognize the name, was one of the people who was killed by the gunman who recently killed 22 people here in Nova Scotia. And a couple of weeks before she died, and her parents, by the way, shot, Emily was part of a Nova Scotian COVID-19 kitchen party. And this is part of our culture out here, of course, on the Maritimes. And like, you know, I would say she's not the greatest fiddler, but man, she gave it her all. And what happened, of course, after her death was this video went viral, and people really just, you know, it was such a neat thing to see a kid just putting herself out there. And then famous fiddlers like Natalie McMaster, when they did the sort of memorial for this, Natalie McMaster sort of does a duet with Emily Tuck. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that we all have talents to show, and I think our job as parents, especially during this pandemic, is not only to help, you know, provide them structure and routines, and to help them express gratitude, and all the other things I've been talking about. It's also about helping them to find new and powerful identities. Let's face it. I have my own son is a elite hockey player. Was recently just drafted into the Q, but that's all gone. So suddenly you have the 17-year-old who's kind of like, who is he? And it's been interesting watching him too try and develop new parts of himself even through this crisis until he can get back to the hockey. So here's a little taste of Emily.
Okay, so your contribution to the COVID kitchen party.
Herbie McLeod.
Wicked.
All right.
And so it goes. There's just a lot of really good things we know that kids who are distracted by activities tend to cope better with stress. And by the way, they also drift into less things like crime, delinquency. There's a wonderful experiment in Iceland from a few years ago where kids were able to, you know, the more they distracted them with activities and gave them lots of opportunities to develop powerful identities, the better they did in life. And you saw dramatic drops in drug use and alcohol and delinquency, all these kinds of things. And of course, I have talked a little bit about this idea of giving kids opportunities to have some sense of control, helping them to be mindful, helping them to self-regulate, but giving them real opportunities where I'm at work, don't just simply say, you know, you can come in. But I mean, I do think we have a right to say to our kids, look, you know, your job is to stay quiet while I am working and paying the bills. But also sense of control is things like for younger children, I love blanket forts. I love that idea of saying to a 5-year-old, build a blanket fort and I will not come into your blanket fort because that's your space, that's your sense of control. But then it works both ways, right? I don't go into your blanket fort behind the sofa. You don't come into my bedroom when the door is shut or my office when the door is shut. And kids can, you know, basically all kinds of ways of finding that space, that sense of control in their lives. Now, just as I'm sort of bringing this fully around, I've been trying to say that we, as the people who promote resilience in our kids, are actually, you know, what the point here is that we need to give them things that are meaningful to them. What I've learned so often from when I see people who are resilient, or I learn from people, they say, it's making me resilient because this was what was given to me was meaningful. So let me give you an example of how, you know, we're trying to do homeschooling. And for many families, it ain't working very well. As I'm not that surprised, because no offense to the schools that are helping to sponsor this, but how much of that education has to be done in the educational setting? But once you're doing homeschooling, it loses its attraction in a sense. It's not as relevant somehow to kids and what they're experiencing. So my point is that playfully, and I was blogging about this in my blog in Psychology Today, was, there's lots of things that we could create chores at home that are part of a homeschooling curriculum. Like if you begin to think creatively, like let's face it, if you're doing the dishes for a younger child, it's an opportunity to learn math. You can learn ratios. This plate is twice as big as that plate. You can do counting games. You can do stacking games. You can do sets. Well, let's do sets of 4, or let's do sets of cutlery, right, for every single placement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Doing the laundry can certainly teach a lot about science. Has your kid never wondered why soap goes in and clean clothes come out? They can be surfing the internet for, is the grocery store open? Indeed, what's at the grocery store? They can be, why aren't they doing the online food orders? I can never understand why parents are wasting our time when we're working. Why are we doing the online grocery shopping? Here's my credit card. You do the online grocery shopping. Before you hit pay, just tell me what the amount is, sort of thing, right? Walking the dog is a great lesson in environmental science, right? If you think about it. Or biology, if you fed the pet an hour before you walk them. Hand washing can replace a class in health. Doing a good deed for a neighbor is a good lesson in civics. And of course, just simply watching the news is a great bit of science as well, understanding vaccines and why we take vaccines, or why we, there's so much great opportunities for learning. And I learned this, by the way, with my own kids. I used to travel with them a lot when they were younger. And I just want to sort of bring this around to one last example. I'm going to open this up to some questions here. And that is, look, when I would take my kids, this is very memorable. We would be traveling for like 2 months at a time in places like Greece and Egypt, and my work would take me all around the globe. So my kids would come with me. I think I got this idea that you can learn everything on the road. We would do about a half-hour a day of math. And of course, we'd be getting the kids to read in an age-appropriate way. So they'd be reading or reading out loud, or we'd be reading to them, whatever was necessary. So that was really at the core. But everything else was sort of learned along the way. And then it was kind of funny. At one point, we were in a small inn in Greece, where mostly it was backpackers, mostly from Australia and other countries, the young people in their early 20s. We were sort of obviously older with the kids. And somehow in this whole world, my kids were helping the owner of the pension collect all the empty bottles, the beer bottles, if you will, from all the other travelers in this place. And they were great. They were just so proud to be helping and contributing and learning a few words in Greek and everything else. Anyways, but periodically during the day, we'd have to sort of do some lessons with them. So we began to, I remember working with my 7 or 8 year old son at the time and trying to get him to do blends, teaching him some of the phonics. At that point, he was struggling a little bit. And we went, let's do the DR blend. So it was dragon and drop and all these kinds of words. And eventually I turned to my son, I said, so do you know any DR blends? And he looks at me and he says, drunk. And at that point we thought maybe their education in that pension had gone a little bit too far. But that's another point, I guess, to make. My point really is, of course, is that there's an abundance of things to going on around our kids. And my real point is that to make kids resilient, we need to offer them those things that are meaningful to them. And when we do that, it really does seem to just help them to be their best, selves. So why don't I pause there? If I could, and I'd love to, I think if I could come back to the organizers here, Anne or Dana or Terry, and I know you possibly have been getting some questions, and maybe I can just kind of follow up with these ideas. Resilience, a long list of potential things that we can do for our kids during the pandemic, but fundamentally make them meaningful, give them real opportunities, get the structure into their lives, and help them show some gratitude and really be part of their communities. Maybe they'll get through this not just okay, but actually stronger than they were before. So I'm going to come out of this for a second and going to come back to you guys, okay?
Great. Thanks very much, Mike, for that. I appreciate, again, your message around resilience sort of developing and unfolding as a result of some challenging opportunities for our kids, and alongside some great support from moms and dads. So I see in the question and answer that there's some good questions. So I'm just going to pop over to that, and I see Terry has joined as well. Terry, can you see the questions in front of you as well?
I can, and it was a question actually that I thought I'd like to push Dr. Unger a bit on, because you started by saying that resilience doesn't come at the time of stress. It actually is built before it happened. And so my question is, what if a family had challenges before the pandemic? Does that mean that they don't have any capacity to build resilience once such a challenge hits them?
No, quite the opposite. We can definitely still develop.
Oh, sure, you'd say that.
Yeah, no, definitely we can. Sorry, and I was using that more example that it's easier if it's been building in a community, in your family, in the schools, in your child, absolutely. But even in a crisis, there is this wonderful opportunity right now for our children to learn to step up. So if your child has always been a little bit self-centered, maybe vulnerable, whiny, not very helpful, whatever, you are in the most precious moment of this child's life. Suddenly they have an opportunity to make a real contribution that's going to matter to their families. And hopefully we're asking our children to step up, to take on some responsibilities, and to understand that, I don't have time for you. I've got to work so that we could pay.
So just to tag on that then, and then I'll step back, Dana. This afternoon in the webinar, you said something that was quite powerful to some of the folks that listened. You were quite prepared to say that kids needed to understand that we're in a serious business right now, and that we need their help, and that it's not okay for them to be distracting when parents are working or whatever. And I think sometimes parents are so worried about worrying their children that they protect them from knowing the realities of situations, because they worry that they're going to make them more anxious or they're going to get more depressed. And I wonder if you can comment on, there's a balance about that.
Yeah, I think the first thing, of course, is that when I study resilience all around the world and kids who get through, inevitably they actually understand the world far more than sometimes our overprotected children in Canada. They understand that there are real consequences to their actions and that their families need them. And I'm talking about often quite young children. Now, I don't want to necessarily say you make every child's life unhappy, but there is something about children thrive when they feel like they're making a genuine contribution, when they know that what they do matters. So if they're picking up their toys, and that means that mom has more time to make dinner, and that dad is going to be able to read them a story later on because there's less stress in that, or whatever. Those kinds of contributions are more genuine, and I think our children need to hear that. And we as parents, by the way, I always hear parents say, I wish my child was learning empathy, and we do all these fake workshops with them, like teach them empathy. And I'm going, well, hang on a minute. Why don't we just talk to our kids in genuine ways and say, I'm having a rough time? Do your children, you're trying to get a more empathetic child. Well, the only way they know that is if they actually see you in a more real way, saying, like today was really, really challenging. You saw me on the line. It was really difficult. Oh my God, that was a stressful day trying to do this and get supper ready. And so why don't we say that to our kids and let them understand? And a 10-year-old can get that. I wouldn't say, I'm not saying open your bank account to your 5-year-old and say, oh my God, I'm overdrawn my checking account. That's not meaningful. But if you have had a really weird experience online or something, and you have a 12-year-old who's a good gamer and was constantly online and stuff, they might have some suggestions for you about how to handle a situation. In other words, create more of a real relationship, and you're actually modeling for your child how you talk about your feelings and how you share, as opposed to, oh my God, most parents fall into these patterns. Terry, you must see this. Parents, they fall into this pattern. Okay, so I have questions for you. You come in the door, it's like, okay, did you do this, Joan? Did you wash your jet? Did you do that? Da, da, da. And that's not a way of building empathy. That's just a way of creating a child who's going to sit there and go, no, leave me alone. I won't go to my room. So let's trigger something a little bit different, especially, by the way. And more so now during a pandemic. We've got to be honest with our kids. We as parents are under a lot of stress. And even if you don't know it, you're your biology knows it. We know from if we took people's heart rates, if we looked at their blood pressure rates, you're going to see a huge spike after this pandemic in terms of a lot of sort of diseases related to allostatic load, like heart disease and this kind of thing. You're going to see a spike in these kinds of things because our systems are under stress. I think our kids can step up and help a bit. Oops.
Good. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. Just going to go back over to Q&A. This question actually might follow nicely from the one that Terry just asked. What if your child is not typically developing? How can you approach resilience when they are already facing challenges that add extra stressors to themselves and to their families?
And I'm taking that the typical development may not was happening before the pandemic. I'm going to make some assumptions on that. I guess I'm kind of that mind that, you know, there's lots of to be said. Atypical development does not necessarily mean abnormal or lesser. It just means a different pathway at a different pace. And when we look at resilience, say of kids with, I have a colleague doing work with children with autism. And when you start talking about resilience, you're going to look at it very differently. For instance, a child with autism may not value relationships in the same way as a child without autism. They value relationships, but in a very perhaps different way. But they also might appreciate their identity being celebrated for some of their unique contributions. In other words, how do we help a child who's developing atypically still have a powerful identity? He'll still have a sense of connections as appropriate, as meaningful to the child. How do we help them to feel a sense of control and decision making, whether that's how they dress themselves or what activities they amuse themselves with? The one that sometimes gets me a little bit, if I can be very transparent, I will often, when I'm talking with parents, sometimes at the end, I'll have a time and parent will ask me, well, you know, my child doesn't have many friends. So, oh, okay, well, is your child like cloistered in their room, crying, depressed, sleep dysregulated? Oh, no, they just don't have friends. And I'm sort of going, so they're shy? They're just like, we have a bit of a, do you ever find that there's a bit of a bias to a certain kind of person these days, that they have to be outgoing, gregarious, entrepreneurial, creative, outspoken? And, you know, I kind of pity the shy, withdrawn kid who just likes to sit in the corner and read. That just, you know, is the creative, sort of reflective, spacey kid. We don't necessarily have a lot of space for those kids anymore. And what I'm really proud of is like our summer camps, which I realize are not going to happen this summer. But I'm really proud of many good summer camps will actually create spaces for every different kind of child to find their space at a summer camp. Those who want lots of activities and those who do need some time out from their busy normal lives when they're back home. So maybe we need to just, you know, create that space for every child to just make a contribution so that they're appreciated and that you know, they're appreciated for what they have to offer. That's my wish anyways.
Good. Thank you. It's just working with some staff in our system, EAs and ECEs, and we're working through the Shanker Merit Center 30-day self-reg challenge. And one of the articles actually during this week's challenge relates to resilience. So he references some of your work and talks about the importance of reducing stressors so that kids actually have the capacity to activate that sort of social interaction, or social engagement, which is your ideal stress response. But sometimes when the stressor load is high, then they're less apt to do that. So just I'm thinking about that in terms of the importance of recognizing stressors and just the right amount, and parents having the role of kind of modulating some of that for kids so that they're actually able to use the relationship, and then be just trusting that parents are there and can support them. And then parents can keep the expectations present as well. And I'm wondering if that might fit with the question around typical development.
And what you're also getting at is that the more the parent is a functioning, strong system, resilience, sometimes we think about it as, okay, I'm just going to change the child. And in fact, that's not really what the science says. In fact, there's some great research on colleagues of mine who are educational psychologists have shown that one of the best ways to raise academic performance of a child in the school is not to work with the child, but to work with the teacher. If you resource teachers with lots of good resources and training, lots of books and crayons and materials and decorations in their offices, and you just treat them really well, GPAs of children go up. You've never talked to the child, but you've just literally done intervention with the teacher, and the teacher creates an environment around. And we know similarly for parents, supporting parents of vulnerable kids, say with children with disabilities or this type of thing, makes the child's life much better, irregardless of if you actually do anything with the child themselves. So there is this kind of notion of strong systems create strong individual children, and therefore, if we can, a parent who creates a stable home and a chance for the blanket fort in the corner, and routines and bedtimes, and eating with the kids 3 times a week, those kids are simply going to be better regulated. They're going to just be a little bit more content, more impervious to depression, even as they suffer the same challenges other kids are being challenged by during this pandemic.
Great. Thank you. Just looking at the next question. My daughter is 7, has a heightened anxiety since the start of the pandemic. I think we've all been hearing similar stories and worries from parents. Has a lot of trouble falling asleep. She now falls asleep between 11 and 12 and doesn't wake up until 9. It used to be 7 a.m. Should I worry about this late start to her day, or focus on what she's getting done, or that she's now getting a longer period of sleep? I feel worried about this once schedules go back to normal. So good question about noticing a change and a pattern in her daughter, and a good question about whether to be concerned.
Well, I'm sure Terry and all the clinicians at Huron-Perth would know that generally speaking, what we look for is you're looking for significant changes that, that's usually when a child shows stress. So, changes in sleep patterns are certainly a stressor like that. The problem with this pandemic is we've lost structure. Am I the only one that doesn't know what day of the week it ever is? Like, reassure me that I'm not the only one, right? So there is a little bit of that. We're sitting all in dark rooms sort of thing, and not quite sure when the sun is up and down, and it's just a very confusing time. So I wouldn't stress too much about this. I would be more that she is getting the right amount of sleep, and maybe it's about increasing. We often, I'm sure other people would say the same. It's about watching diet, increasing activity, physical activity, and a child will naturally sleep. Limiting their exposure to the bad news, and just giving them predictable structures and expectations. And if their life is predictable, 7 years old, they can't probably. Do you remember all those children? Some of you would remember 9/11, which is another sort of big disaster. And 7 years old that was actually quite often. Do you remember the stories about 7-year-olds who, if you ask them, there are hundreds and hundreds of planes running into buildings, because they were seeing them feed the news feeds, and they couldn't understand that it was just the same plane going into the same building. And their comprehension is a little bit off for stuff like that. So it might be a matter of explaining things in ways that the 7-year-old can understand, and buffering that, and reassuring them on what is positive and safe, but being also realistic about the real things that are out of danger. The reason why we're all staying apart is not really that you're in danger, but it's because Granny and Grandpa. I mean, I'm stretching that. Of course, kids are slightly in danger, but realistically, we would not have shut down all society because a very small set of children are developing Kawasaki disease. Like, we wouldn't have completely shut down our entire world for that. So it's a little bit of a realistic appraisal of what the risk is. And I do find that kids, generally speaking, most of my colleagues who work exclusively in this, like more psychiatric, are saying with anxiety disorders, create a realistic appraisal, challenge cognitive distortions, but also set really strong and predictable environments around the child. And they generally bounce back from that anxiety. If it's a situational anxiety disorder, they tend to bounce back from it.
Thank you. What happens If your teen, who is a strong student, has no motivation to do anything, she's not depressed, but doesn't see the point. In the end, she works because she knows she has to, but is less than half-hearted. She is good at being on her own devices, though. So this is a parent who's, again, noticing a pattern or certainly a shift in motivation.
Yeah. I think for a lot of, this is actually a very common pattern right now. And again, I hope other people are nodding their heads at this, that for a lot of teens, their natural point at this point in life is to be out and away and act, disengaging. And that's all being short-circuited. So there's a bit of it's not really depression, it's more reaction. And so it does feel a bit hopeless. I think kids are particularly susceptible to that kind of message. The solution that, if I might, is to turn that into, well, don't necessarily facilitate it. I mean, I wouldn't accommodate that. I'd still expect the child, if you're gardening outside, then they come outside and they garden. If you're cooking, then they cook a meal that day, right? If you're going shopping, they help develop the shopping list. If they, anything that you can do to make them feel a part and to actually make a contribution, I think is really important. And then maybe the other thing is to make, generally speaking, the cure for that sense of helplessness, of course, is giving people a sense of control over something. So maybe it is the point to make decisions, see if there's some decisions that can be made. And coming back to our theory of optimism and hope, it's about also, are there things that they should start planning for next year? When this situation changes, what do they want to be? And I found that this has been some advice I've been getting from other therapists to ask kids that question of what is it that you'd like to come back? So when you come out of this, is there something you want to show other kids that you are now good at or that you can actually do? And this is a wonderful opportunity to reinvent yourself. Now, the kid still might say, I don't want to do that. But then the backup plan is, fine, you don't want to do that? I still need help in the garden. And no, I'm not cooking you a meal until you get out here and help me. This is just being a part of the family. We're all under stress. We got to get physically active. You're out here helping me, right? And there's usually something in it. There's, maybe later in the summer, the carrots that you planted now, I mean, I'm assuming you're running a garden, or maybe it's just the flowers that you're potting or whatever you're doing outside. Maybe something positive will come of that, that sense of this continuity here, and that what I did actually made a contribution forward. I think we really need to make this, somebody earlier today talked about things being embodied, or I was talking to somebody else, but making it very visceral and experiential. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you. What are some ways to help children desire to do chores, keeping on this theme, and take more responsibility organically and not just through rewards? So I think you've kind of touched on this, but
it's not the rewards. You don't want the rewards system. You don't want to be paying kids. Unless your kids pay you to cook dinner, go for it. Right? The day my kid pays me $5 to cook them dinner, I will pay them an allowance to clean up their room, right? We are totally on with that one. But I haven't reached that with my kids, so I'm kind of more of, I have time to drive you to things that you want me to drive you to, or time to read you stories, or time to fix things for you. So you make a contribution to our household. Now, my kids get an allowance, by the way. I have no problems with allowances, but money is about money management and saving and paying for birthday gifts and everything else, right, that people need money for. But I do think in this case, especially during this pandemic, we don't want our kids, basically we're paying them to live in our house. I think this is a time to come back even stronger, to really say to our kids, we need help. We're living all together. We do need to actually be, and if I might, if parents lose faith and think, oh, I can't get them to do this, think about just for a moment, think about the child you're raising will one day be someone's spouse. What kind of spouse are you releasing on the world that can't empty a dishwasher and see it as a deed for another person, right? So you are raising future roommates who are going to be desirable. So, put it into those terms if you want, but there is that need to act. I mean, in all seriousness, there's one of the things when we study resilience all around the world, one of the most common things I've seen in the studies is that kids make a genuine contribution to the welfare of others and their families. And those are the kids that actually show the most resilient under the harshest conditions. And without that, children, I hate to say it, but they descend into a bit of a narcissistic self-infatuation that is not very helpful, not to them and certainly not to us.
We have a few more questions. Are you okay for time, Mike?
I'm okay if people want to hang on for another few minutes, sure.
Okay, I'm just noticing the flow here. So in our household, both my husband and I are still working. I feel a lot of guilt associated with not being able to be home with my children and helping them through homework and schooling. They're doing well in studies. However, this is a good thing for them to be maneuvering through the bulk of the day themselves. We of course help where we can. So here's a parent just commenting, I think, on the load, and I think I'm sort of paying attention to the word guilt.
Yeah,
which I think seems to be part of the job description of parenting sometimes. But you know, a parent here may be feeling the pull and needing to be someplace, but wanting to be someplace else, and may be worried about not being as available to his or her kids as they might like to be. Any thoughts about that?
I guess the reassurance I want to give that is one, our kids, maybe could we reassure parents that actually our kids don't need us that much? Is it okay to say that we don't have to be their playmates, we don't have to make them every meal, we don't have to do all their laundry? It's a nice thing to do maybe, but we actually don't have to do that. And actually, well-functioning families around the world under stress don't usually show those patterns. In fact, the parents are usually hardworking, surviving, and the kids have to look after themselves a bit and step up. So there is something about, there's a principle in resilience called the steeling effect, STEELING, that appropriate and manageable amounts of exposure to adversity or risk actually creates hardier, more grit-like behaviors in children. So if we could change this conversation from I'm guilty to, of course I love my children and would like to spend more time with them, but they're also really now learning skills that are going to put them in good stead later in life. And if you do feel that guilt, then make sure that when you do get home that you really carve out that half hour of time. It's quality time. Put your cell phone, here's my cell, put this thing, a lot of kids say that they are digitally neglected. We as parents have to also turn that off and say, I'm going to spend that quality half hour with my kid, whatever, and do an activity that's meaningful to them, even if it's watching TikTok videos or whatever they're doing. And, you know, just tuning into where they are at and letting them know that they count and that together we are struggling together. And this is a really weird situation, but we are getting through it. And then just expressing gratitude for your day, the fact that I came home and my gosh, the dog was fed. Oh my God, I'm actually grateful for that. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for thinking of this as a family unit. I think that somehow, let's be honest, the kids will actually maybe come out of this again stronger than by us doting on them endlessly.
So this question may flow nicely from that as well. How do you know when your child's response to stressors is beyond what is considered normal and that outside help should be consulted?
Yeah, so again, each of my answers, if you notice what I'm trying to do is I'm thinking about studies of disasters and war-affected children and refugee children and children under stress and children who've been exposed to trauma and abuse and, you know, all these things, right? And in general, the trigger, and I think Terry or somebody just made a comment earlier about it, we know that that's generally triggered by, you see a change, a significant change in behaviors. So if your child was a lazy sloth who never got out of bed in the morning anyways, and now they're a lazy sloth that's not getting out of bed, that's okay, right? But if your child used to be one of those kids that was just bouncing out of the bed at 6 a.m. and just go, and that energy has completely changed, and their eating habits are completely changed, and their bathroom habits are completely changed, and they're not talking to their friends, and everything has changed, that's usually when you want to start reaching out for help. And the good news is, I imagine maybe this is something we can send out, the Kids Help Phone has definitely been a great resource for kids themselves, but I imagine there are resources like that in, there are no resources. No, there are no resources. Terry, I see this Carrie going, No, there are no resources.
We're open and we're here.
Oh, good. Yes, I thought. Yes, thank you. That's why I was kind of moving. I thought you're absolutely. And then the Kids Hope Phone is especially for the kids themselves, but hopefully they're referred back to organizations like Huron-Perth and other to reach out for adult help. To reach out for help. But I usually say, and I'm sure Terry, you could concur with this. It's usually it's the dramatic change. It's not if your child was struggling with bedwetting before the crisis, and they revert a bit back to that. Don't run to the pediatrician. It's just they're in stress increase. They're figuring it out. Everything's wherever the stress point is where it's going to go. If they've never bedwetted since they were 2 and now they're 7 and suddenly they start, then you know you got a problem, right? But if they've had periodic bouts of this every year or so, it's just another part. I mean, it's annoying. I'm not minimizing the pain it is, but it's symptomatic of they're just expressing the stress. If they're developing new stress behaviors that seem to be getting unreasonable and interrupting their normal functioning, that they can't get the tasks done that they need to get done, that's usually when I would say that's usually a good sign for referral. And I'm seeing Terry nod her. I want to make sure that's usually when you see your clients come in.
That would be certainly one circumstance. I think the other one, and I see it's related to a question that's come up around a separated family and how different patterns, the rules in one house are different than the rules in the other. I guess what I would say is, if there were problems present before, things that you were a little troubled about, and then the pandemic hit, the pandemic doesn't make it better. Those problems still are there, but there's still an opportunity to use this time that we have to figure out what message do we want our kids to have now. And so to the point of noticing differences in patterns, yes, we would pay attention to both kinds, whether it was a chronic one that was with them before or whether there was a dramatic change. And then my second point, I guess, is linked to the question around the 8-year-old that just the rules are different in 2 houses. Focus on what's in your control. Those were issues that were there before, and they're still going to be there in spite of a pandemic, but focus on what's in control. I'm feeling for our parents tonight who are pouring their hearts out in terms of some of the questions. Yeah. But what I'm seeing in all of that is people who love their kids, who are trying too hard to do too many things, and then they end up feeling guilty and not actually doing a few good things that they could be doing with what limited energy they've got left after they juggle all of what they juggle. So I wonder if you might give us some kind of rounding remarks that might give some parents some encouragement.
I mean, just to say that, you're there, if you feed them and you're housing them or you're doing your best in those regards. What I've learned from kids all over the world that are living very harsh existences is that a bit of adversity doesn't create long-term trauma. Mm-hmm. It just actually gives them an opportunity to step up and help and to see their lives in perspective and maybe be a little more appreciative when they finally get back onto the soccer pitch or the hockey rink or something. There's a certain appreciation that this actually is valuable. They'll be able to visit grandpa and granny again or any of those things. So let's just cut ourselves some slack and not catastrophize in our minds and understand that there are great opportunities. There are actually opportunities right now for our children to learn the skills for resilience. And it doesn't have to be a big deal for us as parents. It just has to be us creating environments, changing the world around the child so that they have those opportunities to be their better selves. And let's not be shy about doing that as parents, asking our children for help and just insisting that our children do the things that they need to do that is in their own best interest. And they'll be okay. They will be okay.
I think this one last question that I want to come back to might fit nicely with what you just said in terms of kind of expectations or structure, but parent wondering what happens when your child's friends are all hanging out without social distancing. So your kid feels left out and lonely. How do you teach or support resiliency in this situation? I think we've heard this question from lots of parents, actually.
if I might, I'm witnessing this every day as well, so it's not like this is quite not unique. I think for us as parents, we have to make a moral stance about how we're going to approach this, what's valuable, and like with everything, our children are going to be asked to make decisions that are for themselves. I think the more we model, first of all, let's make sure we're modeling what's healthy. The second thing is, there's nothing wrong with asking a child to obey the rules and do a social good. And the social good here is, if our government has said, if we can continue this for another couple of weeks, then we can actually get our lives back to normal. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying to a child, no, this is your social good. And I think our children are guided by, they are expecting us to provide some sort of moral compass. They'll break the rules behind our back a little bit, but I do think that we have to break them, and we don't have to encourage them to break them. I think they're expecting us to be a bedrock of consistency. And I don't have a great answer. And by the way, that's the first one, is ask them, model. So 3 things. 1, model, ask them to do a social good. And if I might, the third one is figure out some workarounds. So it's not always no. We've sent our son, he was trying, he was going to pull the same thing off, right? And we said, look, we don't want you to do that. You're not going to go down to the basketball court and play, but if you want to go for a walk with your friend and you guys just walk on opposite sides of the street. And we trusted him, and we talked about, what it would be like, and if the police pull him over, because you can get fined and all this kind of stuff. We said, we're 6 feet apart, we're across, like there are strategies here. So let's work a little bit on these strategies, adapt, but also model, and hopefully ask our kids to step up. And maybe we'll all be safer, and we'll get through this faster as well.
It's an important message.
Sure.
Just back to the question and answer space, and I think we've been able to respond to questions. I am noticing somebody's comment here about we've talked about writing our own stories along with illustrations that express how we feel, a good exercise for all. I think that was posted, I think maybe in reference to some of this conversation, or just back to how, just opportunities to connect and be able to kind of keep the conversation open with our kids about what we're expecting or how we're feeling about some of the stress or how hard it is, kind of creating a collective story about it. I'm wondering if perhaps.
Oh, I love that. And kids draw, instead of asking them what are you grateful for, to take pen and pencils and crayons and say draw something nice that happened today. Anything that animates those conversations is going to be that much better. Or call your grandmother and tell her what you liked about today, rather than sitting here and telling me, because I get, you're probably bored with me anyways. We've had too many hours together. So call a friend and tell them what you're grateful for. I mean, it doesn't always have to be about us. Yeah, love that idea.
Yeah, very creative. Good. Okay, I think we're probably through questions. Want to just thank everybody again for joining us tonight, and for some of your really good questions and thought-provoking comments, and just opportunity to kind of deepen the conversation around building resilience. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Anne.
I think it's me.
It's actually Terry tonight.
Yep.
Hey.
I'm back to plan A. I'm on for today. I just want to say thanks that this webinar has been possible because of the organizations that we named earlier that work together with us in the community, including our 2 school boards. We are grateful for Jim Cummings of the Huron-Perth Catholic District School Board, who produced and provided us tons of technical support. And I would say that if ever there's been a time in our history that we've needed to pay attention to what do we need in order for us to be available to others, it is now. Tonight has been a lot about the burden of parents and the juggle that they've got between some of the worries we've got is worries about kids, but also the challenges of managing their load. And I think, Mike, you help us put some things in perspective. Even in difficult times, there are moments where there can be great learning, and that's actually how we bring out the best in each other and in our kids. So on behalf of the Huron-Perth community, I want to thank you for your message and your continued support as we continue to try and deepen our understanding of your work in our work with kids and families.
It's inspiring. Thanks for all the support on this too. Good to connect.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks everybody for
some things on social media. There were a couple of questions about resources. Maybe we could put a few things out tomorrow.
Sounds good. Any other parting comments, questions for folks before we wrap up?
No.
Thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
All the best.
Okay.
Well, how do you feel that